Hey everyone. So really quickly before we get started, my series attempting to recreate Samuel Edward Konkin's lost book entitled Agora Contra Marxism has been downgraded to a pet project rather than my $100 Patreon incentive. For one, I've been feeling a real lack of motivation to work on that project, as I have with a lot of my videos lately. I guess I'm just sort of in a rut right now, and I realize after finishing part 1 just how hesitant I am to actually approach it, because I respect this man's work so much and am admittedly intimidated by the ambition of this project. But that's not fair on you, the patron, so I've decided that instead of being a complete dick and scrapping the incentive altogether, which, to be clear, I'd never do because I actually care about you guys, I've decided that if you're a patron of mine on the date this video was uploaded, I'm giving you an opportunity to recommend one video you want to see me respond to of your choice. I of course can't guarantee when the video will be up, but they will be at the top of my priority list. Thank you all so much for supporting this channel. All the help you guys provide does help quite significantly towards the future of content produced here. It's really appreciated. Also, one last thing. I finally got around to opening up a PayPal business account for those of you who want to donate with individual contributions but don't want to subscribe or become a patron on any premium services. The link to that will be located in the description of every video from now on. Anyway. Hello everyone. So if you've ever tried to argue against a democratic socialist or a progressive about economics, you've undoubtedly run into this canard.
He goes on to give a fantastic answer, but basically what it boils down to is, he's in favor of a system like Denmark, or Norway, or Sweden. A social democracy. Like, you know, much of Europe.
Problem with socialism, in the words of Margaret Thatcher, at a certain point you run out of spending other people's money. Venezuela, one of the richest countries in the world in the 70s. Now, the average Venezuelan has lost 24 pounds because they're starving to death. 90% of the country is living in poverty.
I think she's talking more about Scandinavia than Venezuela.
How did I know you have? It's essentially their go-to argument at the first sign of even light scrutiny, almost like a hideous reflex their mind contorts into as an irrational defense mechanism. Scandinavia! Real socialism doesn't look like Venezuela or Cuba. It looks like Scandinavia. Except yes it does, and no it doesn't. But before we go any farther, because this is a topic that the ideological left has consistently failed to defend itself on, ideological leftists have structured this entire debate in a very Orwellian fashion. I'll just go ahead and let Kyle explain how they describe it.
So, democratic socialism, in reality, actually is post-capitalist. It's a post-capitalism philosophy. So in other words, it doesn't coexist with capitalism. It's not a mixed market economy. It is post-capitalist. So what that means is social ownership of the means of production. But what you see here is they're not describing that. They're not describing a post-capitalist philosophy. They're describing a system that coincides with capitalism. So what they're defining, and when I say they, I mean MSNBC in this clip, Bernie Sanders, and many others, what they're really describing is social democracy, in the sense that now the term democratic socialist is being used interchangeably with social democracy. I don't think there's any putting the cat back in that bag. I don't think it's going to happen. And I think that we lost that once Bernie Sanders described himself as a democratic socialist, even though he's a social democrat. So what I do now is I just use it interchangeably. And when I talk about democratic socialism, I mean both democratic socialism, the post-capitalist philosophy, but also social democracy. So in a weird way, there's like a moderate/centrist version of democratic socialism, which is social democracy. And then there's the actual left version of democratic socialism, which is post-capitalist.
The ideological left have essentially started using the term democratic socialism as a political term rather than to describe a philosophy. And as a political term, it refers to multiple belief systems, all of which contradict one another. I discussed in the previous video regarding the migrant caravan of the 2018 US midterms that political terminology is deliberately structured in as arbitrary of a manner as possible as a means of ensuring that the political elite can control public discourse, and this is perhaps the most blatant example of this currently in mainstream politics. The term democratic socialism in its political use refers to both a market system and the collectivization of private property and state management of the means of production. Supporters of democratic socialism can arbitrarily switch between which system they support based solely on convenience. This makes casual discussion of the ideas in question next to impossible because you need to debate the terminology and establish an ethical framework around it before you can even begin to argue the ideas. And even if you do have an actual debate format established, criticizing ideas proposed by democratic socialists is impossible because their political stance is made up of a series of contradictory positions. For example, in this format, you can't criticize democratic socialism on the grounds that economic calculation in a centrally planned economy is impossible because democratic socialism both represents central planning and a market-based system, so in response, democratic socialists can point to market systems which aren't suffering from the economic calculation problem to counter this argument. Therefore, you must refer to social democracies as social democracies or democratic socialist systems as such, because to do otherwise is intellectually dishonest. So, to be clear, the countries which are now commonly listed as examples of democratic socialism, Sweden, Denmark, Switzerland, Norway, or Iceland, are not examples of democratic socialism. These are market-based economies with welfare states, similar to the US or any other market-based system in the world, really. But why are they so much more successful despite having a welfare state? Well, this is actually pretty simple. These countries are not actually the heavily regulated economies that the media and politicians paint them out to be. In fact, every single one of the 5 countries which are commonly cited as examples of regulation or welfare statism succeeding rank higher than the US on the Index of Economic Freedom. With the exception of Norway, however, that only happened recently. They have fewer regulations on trade which allow producers to pay their employees more, innovate more, create better quality products, and allow for more competition. For example, none of the countries which I just listed have minimum wage laws, and most things which are credited to the government are oftentimes not created by federal laws, but are in fact either standard practice in the market from the increased competition, or were negotiated by unions. And for the record, union membership in all of the previously noted countries is voluntary with the exception of Sweden and Iceland, and businesses in both of these countries, even with that, have more autonomy over hiring an association than they do in the US. Point is, higher wages, more vacation time, the better quality products and commodities, or morale, cannot be credited to the government, and the European welfare states are just as unsustainable as the US or any other welfare state, as growing spending leads to growing entitlement, which will inevitably lead to lower competition and productivity, since it reduces incentives and the amount of money that producers can invest into the market. And this results in a vicious cycle where the government tries to raise taxes to fund the growing entitlements. The taxes increasing further reduce competition, which reduces productivity, which increases the cost of commodities on the market, only to continue repeating the cycle until the market just collapses because nobody can afford to live in these countries anymore. This is exactly what happened to Greece, Italy, and is slowly beginning to happen to France. The Scandinavian model is able to sustain itself in the short term because as of right now, they have a more competitive market market, which produces more. Consequently, their governments can obtain more revenue with lower tax rates. Now, this is not to say that these countries are secret free market utopias or anything of that nature. In fact, there are aspects of their economy which are indeed heavily regulated or nationalized, the most common example being their healthcare systems. But their healthcare systems are in serious decline. I have a full-length video going over in detail specifically why socialized healthcare is doomed to fail. Not to go too much into it, but because nationalized systems don't have market signals, otherwise known as supply and demand curves, they will never be able to properly allocate their resources and will therefore always need to resort to rationing. Hence why systems with nationalized healthcare have such a terrible quality of service. So no, Scandinavian countries are not examples of successful social democracy, democratic socialism, or even welfare statism. In fact, it's a continental vindication of arguments against welfare statism and regulation in favor of competition and deregulation. And as I've presented, the mainstream political narratives surrounding conditions in these countries or what caused them are lies by omission or outright lies. Regardless, that's all for today's video. If you guys liked it, please comment, rate, and subscribe, and I will see you all next time.